After an agonizing 20 of labor, my husband picked up the birth certificate and declared, "Our baby girl is getting my mom's name, not yours." I objected, but he mockingly replied, "Your opinion doesn't count here." The nurse looked at me and asked quietly, "Do you want me to tell him the truth?" My heart raced as his world began to crumble right before my eyes. My husband Jake and I had been together for 6 years, 3 of them married. I thought we had a strong relationship, but I was wrong. I should have noticed the warning signs, I really should have. From the first time I met Jake's mom, Elizabeth, I knew she didn't like me. She was the kind of woman who turned every conversation into a monologue about herself, who acted like she owed everything to everyone, and who thought her son was some kind of saint. At first it was small things, barbed remarks, hidden insults, petty jabs at my appearance, my background, even my job. But as time went on, things escalated. She needed to be in control of every aspect of Jake's life. When we got engaged, she made a scene because Jake had picked out the ring himself instead of trusting her with the choice. When we bought our first house, she criticized the neighborhood, the layout, and the color of the walls as if it were her place. She would drop by unannounced and act like she was living with us. Every time I complained, Jake waved it off. "She's like that, you know, it's no big deal, she's not mean." Yes, she was. She wanted to be the main woman in his life, and the fact that he chose me made her hate me. I hoped things would get better with the pregnancy, but I was wrong. When Elizabeth found out we were having a baby, she became unbearable. Suddenly she had complaints about everything. She didn't like the baby names I'd chosen, she pushed her ridiculous pregnancy diet on me, even tried to tell me which gynecologist to see as if my doctor wasn't good enough. And Jake? Jake just indulged her. He'd always been a mama's boy, but I didn't realize how serious it was. 6 months pregnant, Elizabeth said a phrase that still makes my blood run cold. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "I hope the baby inherits Jake's family traits, yours won't fit a girl." Jake stood beside me and remained silent. That was the first time I felt like something was broken in our marriage. Fast forward to the day of the birth. They were unbearable. 20 hours of pain, my body tearing apart, and Jake was barely supporting me. Not in the physical sense he was in the room, but in his thoughts and feelings, somewhere far away. He was on the phone talking to my mom, going out for coffee twice while I screamed in pain. And then, finally, our daughter was born. I barely had time to hold her in my arms before Jake snatched the certificate form from the nurse. He didn't even look at me, didn't even ask my opinion. "Our baby will get my mom's name," he said like it was a done deal. I thought he was joking. No, he wasn't. I was exhausted, weak, still shaking, but I managed to squeeze out, "No." "We'd already picked out a name together, hadn't we?" He smirked, and said, "Your opinion doesn't count." My breath caught. Before I realized what was happening, the nurse, an older woman with a discerning eye, leaned over to me and whispered, "Do you want me to tell him the truth?" I turned my head toward her, my heart pounding frantically. I didn't know what she meant, but the look on her face told me she knew something important, and it was about to change everything. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my chest. Jake, still grinning like he'd won, was filling out the form, not noticing the atmosphere in the room thickening. I forced myself to speak, my voice weak but firm. "What do you mean?" I whispered to the nurse. Her gaze flickered to Jake, then back to me. "Not here," she murmured, "but trust me, you need to know." A chill ran down my spine. I looked at Jake, who still didn't suspect a thing, and something in me snapped. "You're not naming her after your mother?" I said, and my voice suddenly grew stronger. Jake froze, stopping writing, and looked at me like I'd slapped him. "Excuse me?" "She's our daughter," I muttered through clenched teeth. "We agreed on a name, you can't change it without me." His jaw tensed. "My mom." "I don't care." I'd never seen Jake truly angry with me before. Annoyed, yes, upset often, but this was different. His face contorted, and he said coldly, quietly, "Your opinion doesn't count. After all I've done for you, you should be grateful that I'm even allowing your last name to be added to the certificate." I felt as if I'd been punched in the stomach. The nurse drew in air sharply. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. Jake continued, "If you don't like it, maybe you shouldn't have racked my brain like that during the pregnancy. You had one job to carry my baby. I make the decisions, that's my right." Something in me snapped. And then the nurse did something I hadn't expected. She snatched the clipboard out of Jake's hands. "You're not talking to her like that." Jake turned sharply toward her, shock reflected on his face. What the hell? But the nurse wasn't listening to him. She flipped the papers over and looked him in the eye. You're lucky she doesn't know the whole truth yet, she said calmly. And then I realized he was hiding something. I looked at Jake. He'd gone pale. What is she talking about? Nothing, he answered too quickly. She's lying. The nurse interrupted. I don't think so. His gaze darted between us, his body tense. Then the nurse leaned over and said quietly, check the insurance papers. I froze, comprehending her words, and suddenly it hit me like a thunderclap. Jake had handled all the insurance paperwork during my pregnancy. I trusted him. I hadn't checked. Why would I do that? Unless... I turned to him, my throat dry. Jake, what did you do? His hands clenched into fists. Nothing. But sweat broke out on his forehead. His breathing quickened. He was nervous. The nurse exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I've seen this before. Women come in, think everything's fine, confide in their husbands, and then find out they weren't even listed as the primary parent. I was thrown cold. Jake jumped up from his chair. We're leaving. I ignored him. You falsified my insurance information? My voice shook. I did what I had to, he retorted. You wouldn't understand. Then explain. Silence. The nurse crossed her arms. Do you want me to get the paperwork? I can right now. Jake's face contorted with rage. He turned to me. You're not going to do that. You just had a baby, you're hormonal, you're not thinking straight. But I was thinking, and I knew for sure. He'd tricked me. Jake grabbed my wrist, not hard but firmly. We're not discussing this here. I wrenched my hand away. You're not my boss. His jaw twitched, and for the first time I saw fear, not anger, in his eyes. The nurse looked at me. Do you want to see the paperwork? I didn't hesitate. Yes. Jake laughed bitterly. Okay, you want the truth? You weren't supposed to see them. The room seemed to shrink. The nurse looked at me. I'll get them. She walked out, leaving me alone with Jake. I stared at him. You're going to tell me what's going on right now. He ran his hand through his hair. You don't understand how hard it's been for me. My mom. Your mom? She wanted me to control everything. He continued and exhaled sharply. I waited. She said she knew what was best for the baby, he finally admitted. Said you were too emotional, too weak, that I should take matters into my own hands. I felt nauseous. So what, you took me off our daughter's insurance? Made yourself the sole legal guardian? Jake was silent, and that was the answer. The nurse came back with a folder, placed it in my lap, and opened it. And there it was. Jake listed himself as the only parent. My name wasn't there. My whole body went cold. You were going to take her away from me? Jake didn't deny it. I almost threw up. The nurse's voice was hard as steel. You're lucky I noticed that. I've seen women lose their babies to shenanigans like that. Jake stood up. You're exaggerating. I shook my head. I'm done with you. He laughed like I was a joke. What, you think you can walk away? You just gave birth, where are you going to go? The nurse put a hand on my shoulder. She won't be alone. Jake's grin twitched, and I realized his world was about to fall apart. Jake's face was a mixture of rage and despair. I could see him thinking feverishly, thinking he could talk me down, the way he always manipulated me. Not this time. I turned to the nurse. What do I do next? She looked at me carefully. Are there any relatives nearby that you trust? Yes, my sister Lily. She lived half an hour away and, unlike Jake, genuinely cared for me. I reached for the phone to call her, but Jake snatched it out of my hands. You're not doing that, he growled. The nurse stepped between us, her voice cutting the air. Give her the phone back. Now. He hesitated for a moment, then tossed the phone on the bed. You're making a mistake, he muttered. I ignored him and dialed Lily. She answered after the second beep. Hey, what's up? How's the baby? I opened my mouth, but the words stuck in my throat, like if I spoke I'd burst into tears. The nurse took the phone from my hands and said, Hello Lily, this is Nurse Anna from the hospital. Your sister needs your help right away. Lily didn't hesitate. I'm on my way. Jake snorted bitterly. Really? Running to your sister? She doesn't even like me. I glared at him. Maybe because she figured out your lies before I did. His face darkened. That's ridiculous. The nurse cut him off sharply. What's funny is what you tried to pull. And believe me, the hospital staff won't let that happen. We don't like it when men try to take children away from their wives. Jake's fists clenched, but he remained silent. I turned to the nurse. Can we correct the paperwork? She nodded. Yes, and we'll document everything. If he tries anything, there'll be a legal trail. Jake tensed. You're making a big deal out of this. But he was sweating. He knew he'd lost control. That's when his phone rang. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I saw the name on the screen, Mom. And everything fell into place. He wasn't acting alone, his mother was involved. Jake dropped the call, but I grabbed his arm, not letting him put the phone away. You're going to tell me the truth? I said, shaking with anger. There's nothing to tell. The nurse crossed her arms. Either tell me now or she'll find out from the legal documents. It's over anyway. Jake's gaze flickered to me, then to the baby in my arms. For the first time I saw guilt. I needed to hear it from him. What did you do? Silence. I reached for his phone, but he yanked his hand away. Okay, he barked. You want the truth? My mother said the baby has to be registered only to me. That way if you try to leave you can't have her. The room spun. I pulled my daughter tighter against me, my whole body trembling. She said she'd get me a lawyer, he continued bitterly. Said the court would give me custody because you make less money and if I do it right I'll win. His stomach twisted. His mother had planned to take the baby away from me before she was even born, and Jake had agreed. I felt nauseous. Why? I whispered. Why did you do this to me? Jake rubbed his face with his hand. Because you never respected my mother. Silence hung in the room. The nurse awed. Oh my God, she muttered. I let out a cold, hollow laugh. You wanted to steal my daughter because I didn't idolize your mother? Jake didn't answer, and that said it all. The nurse turned to me. We'll fix that right away. She took my papers and walked out, probably to get the hospital administrator. Jake took a step toward me. Look, this has gone too far, we can work this out. I held my daughter tighter. We're gone. His face contorted. I'm her father. And I'm her mother. I cut him off. And unlike you, I don't use her as a tool. His jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. No, I said firmly. The mistake was trusting you. At that moment Lily walked in. Seeing my face, she immediately knew something was wrong. What the hell is going on? Before I could answer, Jake's phone rang again. This time Lily snatched it out of his hands. She looked at the screen. There were messages, dozens of messages. Unlocking the phone, she knew the password. Of course she turned pale. She turned the screen back to me and the world shook again. There were Jake's correspondences with another woman. Can't wait to see you. When the baby's born we'll finally be together. She'll have nothing left. She'll be stuck. Lily's face reddened with rage. Are you bloody serious? Jake went white. I stared at the messages, my vision blurred. He wasn't just going to take my daughter, he was going to leave me for someone else while I carried his child. A strange calm swept over me, a dangerous calm. I looked at Jake and whispered, You have no idea what you've done. Jake rushed to the phone, but Lily bounced back. Oh no, you bastard, she hissed. You're not getting out of this. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, the letters blending together, my hands shaking as I flipped through the correspondence. Jake wasn't just having an affair, a full-blown relationship, and not just cheating but an elaborate plan. She'll have nothing left, she'll be stuck. The phrase hit me like a bullet to the chest. It wasn't about love, it wasn't even about me, it was about power. He wanted to corner me, take my child away, take away my rights, leave me with nothing, and then leave me for someone else. I was drowning. My heart was pounding in my ears, my body still weak from childbirth, my newborn daughter sleeping in my arms, unaware that the man who was supposed to protect her had betrayed her before she even opened her eyes. I turned to Jake. Who is she? He opened his mouth but didn't make a sound. Lily flicked onward, her face darkening. Then she froze. Oh my God. She looked up at me, eyes wide. You're not going to believe this. She turned the phone toward me again and I saw a familiar name. It was Elizabeth's best friend's daughter, the same perfect girl Elizabeth had been pushing him toward for years instead of me. The world tilted. This wasn't just control, not just cheating, it was planned, orchestrated, and Jake had agreed to it. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, still feeling the pain from labor, and shoved my phone at his chest. How much? My voice was frighteningly flat. Jake was still pale. It's not what you think. Lily laughed bitterly. Really? Because it looks like you and Mommy were planning a new life without my sister. Jake's jaw tensed. She wasn't supposed to find out about it like that. I let out a harsh, mirthless chuckle. She wasn't supposed to find out like that? I repeated. You mean I was just supposed to wake up one day and realize that my husband stole my daughter and replaced me? He rolled his eyes. He had the nerve to roll his eyes. You're being dramatic. Fire erupted in me. I grabbed the certificate form from the hospital table and ripped it in half. You don't control me, you don't control her. My voice shook with rage. The door swung open and Elizabeth walked in. Her gaze traveled around the room, stopping at the torn papers in my hands, then at the phone with the open messages. She froze, then her lips curved. Well, she said flatly, there doesn't seem to be any point in pretending. Lily made a sound, half chuckle, half astonishment. Really? You're not even going to tell me off? Elizabeth smirked, and in that moment I realized, she wasn't sorry. This wasn't a mistake, it was her plan all along. I turned to Jake. You let her do it. Jake swallowed but remained silent. He had nothing to say, he had betrayed me completely. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice frighteningly calm. Listen, sweetheart, you have to realize that this is what's best for the baby. I pulled my daughter tighter against me. It's best for my baby girl to stay away from you. Elizabeth sighed like I was a cranky child. You don't have the means to raise her on your own, she said coldly. Be realistic. Jake makes more money, he has stability, you don't. Lily snorted. Oh, shut the hell up. If you think my sister is going to give up and let you steal her baby, you're dumber than I thought. Elizabeth turned to Jake. Deal with it. And then I noticed, he hesitated. For years he'd been under her control, doing whatever she told him to do, but now he was trapped. I leaned closer and whispered, if you do this, I will destroy you. He blinked. You don't? I'll sue, I continued. I'll expose everything. Your fake insurance papers, your cheating, your attempt to steal my baby. I'll make sure you never see her again. His gaze flickered to Elizabeth, and for the first time he looked uncertain. Elizabeth noticed it too. Jake, she barked. She's bluffing. I looked her straight in the eye. Let's see who wins. Silence. And that's when Jake snapped. He turned to his mother and said, Mom, I can't. Elizabeth tensed. I'm sorry? His voice was barely audible. I didn't think it would go this far. Elizabeth's face contorted with anger. Don't be an idiot, we discussed this. Jake looked at me, then at the baby in my arms and stepped back. I can't, he repeated. Elizabeth snapped. After everything I've done for you, you'd throw that away for her? Jake flinched and I realized I'd won. Not because Jake's conscience had suddenly awakened, but because he was weak and for the first time his mother wasn't pulling his strings. Elizabeth stormed out of the room in a rage. Jake didn't follow her. Lily called our lawyer cousin and he rushed to the hospital. With the nurse's papers, we fixed the paperwork, securing full custody of me. Jake didn't fight back. I think he knew he had lost. A few days later, I left the hospital with my daughter. Jake didn't come home with us. And Elizabeth tried to contact me, even showed up at my apartment, but I wouldn't let her in. Lily called the police and eventually she backed off. Jake moved out, I filed for divorce. And that other woman left him as soon as she realized he had nothing left. It took me a while to realize what had happened, to accept that the man I loved, the man I was married to, was planning to destroy me. But now, holding my daughter in my arms, I knew one thing. I had won. Not in petty revenge, not so much that the pain would go away, but I had pulled through. And Elizabeth had lost. She had tried to build the perfect life for her son and ended up with nothing. I, on the other hand, had everything that mattered.